Hey, welcome back to all my 6th grade math students. We're going to take a look at lesson 6. We're going to be on page 8, and today we're going to focus on, we're going to combine integer problems with subtraction. So when we see a subtraction problem here. So before we get started with the subtraction, I just want to clarify when we're looking at these integer expressions or these integer problems that we understand what's going on. So we've previously talked about, I remember the last couple days, we're always focusing on our first integer and starting with our first integer. And we've talked about this, but we haven't really identified it. This is our operation. So some of these expressions can be a little confusing, but we have our first integer, which is -5, and we're adding a second integer to that. So -5 and -3. And this is going to be our second integer. Same thing over here. So we're going to have an operation in the middle. We're always going to have our first number, that's our first integer. We're going to have an operation, and then we're going to have a second integer. Now, some students will confuse this with a negative sign with that second integer. Well, we're always going to have an operation sign right after the first number. So this is actually the operation. So this one is adding, and this one is subtracting, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So last 2 days we've been working on adding or making these and problems, or -5 and -3 as far as combining. So today we're going to look at how can we take a subtraction problem and make it into an addition problem, or make it into something that we've been doing already. So this is our second integer. And if there's no sign right in front of it, this is an operation sign. If there's no sign, then we're going to assume that that is a positive integer. And that is our second integer. So our trick, when we take a look at these subtraction problems, we need to remember something we've been doing since last week, is whenever we see this negative sign or we see a subtraction sign, we need to be thinking the opposite. So if we look at this first subtraction problem, what we're going to do is identify the first integer, and we have -4. That's not going to change. What's going to change, what we can do is, if we take a look at this subtraction, we're actually going to think of this subtraction as the opposite of addition. So if this is the opposite, if we're going to subtract a number, well, subtracting a number would actually be the same as adding the opposite. So we're going to change this into subtracting 2 is actually going to be the same as -4 and 2 if we're making it to an addition problem. So I know it may just be a little confusing. We're going to go through a few examples, and it should make some more sense here. So what we're going to do today is change subtraction to and expression. Change. So we're going to change subtraction to an expression, which actually means addition. So instead of subtracting integers, we're going to change it into something that's more familiar. So on the number line, starting with our first integer, we have -4 starting at 0, and we're going to go in the negative direction 4 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4. -4. So what we're going to say is if we subtract 2 more, subtracting 2 more, you're already at -4, and subtraction just means we're going to be taking away, and we will continue going negative. And if we take away, we subtract 2 more, we're actually going to be going more negative anyway. So that is actually, it shows subtracting is actually the opposite of 2. The opposite of taking away 2 is going to be looking at just adding 2 negatives. So the result is, let's put it right here, so -4, and if we subtract 2, -4 subtract 2, it does equal -6. So the number line matches up with the concept. If we look at -4 and -2, they're both the same. So if we change it to an opposite statement where we can combine it, 4 negatives and 2 negatives does come out to 6 negatives. So if we think about this, if we take away, we subtract 2 positives, it's actually going to be the same as adding 2 negatives. Either way, you're getting more negative. Okay, so let's look at another example here. So if we have -2 subtract -3, let's change that into an opposite statement and an and statement. What this is really saying is subtracting this integer is the same as combining the opposite. So the opposite of subtracting 3 negatives, what's the opposite of subtracting -3? It's going to be actually the same as combining 3 positives. So if we take away negatives, we think about it, if we're taking away 3 negatives, if you're taking away negatives, what direction are you going on the number line? You're taking away less negatives, you're becoming more positive. So that does make sense if we have 2 negatives and 3 positives. So starting on the number line, we're going to go to the first integer, which is -2. And this says subtracting negatives. Well, if we subtract negatives, that means we're going to take these away. So we would actually take away 1 negative, take away 2 negatives, and take away 3 negatives. So taking away negatives means we're going in the positive direction. So if we take these away, that's the same as 2 negatives and 3 positives. So this still checks out. So let's do one more example. Let's say we start with positives this time, and then we need to take away 2 negatives. Let's use our strategy here. Instead of subtracting, let's do our opposite and combine and put together the opposite of 2 negatives. So the opposite of taking away 2 negatives is going to start with, we have 5 positives and 2 negatives. What's the opposite of -2? positive 2. So let's take a look here. If we start at positive 5, start with our first integer. So we're going to move 5 spaces to the right. And even though we don't have any negatives here, it says if we're going to take away negatives, if we were on the negative side, if we were taking away negatives, it's becoming more positive. So we would take away 1 negative, take away 2 negatives. And we're going to move 2 spaces in the positive direction. So becoming less negative means you're becoming more positive. So taking away 2 negatives is the same as adding 2. So we had 5 positives, and then we took away some possible negatives, and we moved in the positive direction. So that is actually the same as going positive 2. So we're going to use this strategy today, practicing. Anytime we see the operation is subtraction, we're going to think of this subtraction as the opposite and make a combining statement. So the opposite of this integer is actually what we're combining. Our last statement for today, whenever we're talking about subtracting integers, what we're really saying is subtracting integers, we can do that by combining the opposite of that second integer.